The structural problem here, which has been the European structural problem for decades, is that the policies we need are now European, but the politics remain national.
Hello and welcome to Independent Thinking, the weekly podcast from Chatham House. I'm Bronwen Maddox. This week, the team and I were in Berlin for our annual conference looking at Europe's strategic choices, and there are real choices to be made. We're talking, as well as we are on this podcast, about whether Europe can hold together as it faces the big three challenges: Russia, in terms of security, migration, and economic growth, or the lack of it. Europe's security and economic prospects are at greater risk now than at any time in the last 30 or so years. The economy, the largest single economic bloc in the world before 2008, has been overtaken by the United States in terms of size and speed of growth. Right-wing, in some cases hard-right governments and political parties have grown in power. The ongoing challenge of immigration is one reason, but it's not the only one. European countries continue to work out how to support Ukraine against Russia, but many are fearful that Vladimir Putin's ambitions go much further. And all this when the countries once described as the engine of Europe, that's France and Germany, are stalling. In France, hard-right leader Marine Le Pen could bring down the country's fragile government if she votes against the budget, itself an attempt to deal with France's financial problems. Germany faces an election in February after the collapse of Olaf Scholz's three-party coalition in another financial row, this time about debt and investment. And drop one new factor into all that, Donald Trump is about to return to the White House with a new set of challenges for Europe. To discuss all this, I'm joined by a fantastic set of guests. First, to journalist and commentator, Professor Timothy Garton Ash from the University of Oxford. Welcome.
Hi, morning.
Very good to have you with us. Returning to the podcast is Mujtaba Rahman, Europe Managing Director at the Eurasia Group. Welcome back.
Thank you for having me.
Very good to have you here. And finally with me in the studio is a familiar voice, Armida van Rij, Senior Research Fellow and the head of our Europe programme with me in Berlin earlier this week. Welcome back.
Thanks, Bronwen. Good to be back on the podcast and in London.
So let's kick off with these crises facing Europe, the big three: growth, Russia, migration. Timothy, I wonder if you could take us into the challenge as you see it.
In conditions of very low growth, and particularly the dramatic crisis of Europe's central economy, the German economy, there's massive pressure on resources, on public spending, at a time when there is clear consensus that in the face of both Putin and Trump, European countries need to spend significantly more on defense. The conversation now is about 3% of GDP, not 2%. Where's that money going to come from, as well as the investment in infrastructure that's badly needed? Add to that focused on the image of immigration, you have hard-right, nationalist, populist parties across Europe heading up towards a third, if not more, of the vote, not just in Eastern Europe, but right across the continent. In the coalition in the Netherlands, Marine Le Pen in a pole position in France, AfD doing extraordinarily well in Germany. And those parties are often pro-Russian and obviously highly focused on defense. And you have a really dramatic convergence of circumstances. I think there's an intellectual recognition that Europe has to get its act together, do more investment, as Mario Draghi has just suggested, do more for its own security. But as a former president of the European Council said, we know what we need to do, we just don't know how to do it and get re-elected.
This was Jean-Claude Juncker, I think, back in the day. One of the most memorable things he said.
One of the perhaps few memorable things he said.
I didn't want to go quite that far, but yes. So, Mujtaba, I wonder if you could take us just into the economic aspect of that. Timothy's talked about the convergence of all these problems. Mario Draghi, distinguished Eurocrat, if I can put it that way, threw down a challenge with a recent analysis saying Europe is getting comprehensively left behind in the race for new technology and therefore of the growth that its economies need so much. How much is this the economic component of this whole crisis?
It's a major challenge. We can assess the quantum of the challenge. It's 800 billion per year. That's the investment gap that Mario Draghi talked about. It's a very odd thing because his report landed and everyone accepted, I think, the arguments that he was making, as well as some of the solutions that Draghi put forward. At the same time, there was an immediate recognition that it's very unlikely a lot of the things he's advocating for in that report are likely to be implemented, whether it's a more coherent fiscal policy, whether it's a more coherent pan-European industrial policy, whether it's a more sensible policy towards China, the way the Europeans are thinking about trade. Across all elements of the report, I think there was a general recognition it's well put together, it's thoughtful, it identifies the correct problems, but the political situation in Europe just doesn't enable many of the proposals that he's put forward to be advanced. And in particular, of course, I'm talking about the paralysis in Germany in light of the election we'll now have on the 23rd of February, as well as the chaos in France over both government stability and the fiscal challenges the minority Barnier government is facing. Final point I would make is, I do think the Donald Trump, his return to the presidency, it does potentially create an opportunity to move against some of the things that Draghi was talking about on the economic side, especially if countries begin to think about fiscal policy in a slightly more systematic and coherent way, and they start thinking about ways in which they can raise the kind of money that I think they need to in order to make these economies competitive.
Armida, the political crises in Germany and France are partly driven by arguments over the budget, over the need to invest more. Can you just take us into a bit more what is happening there?
All roads lead back to Macron, I think, to some extent, which is after quite a poor result in the European parliamentary elections, he decided he wanted to call for parliamentary elections in France. There we saw the National Rally, Marine Le Pen's party, win a third of the votes, a third of the seats, which was a huge increase from where they were previously, which has now led to this position where Macron and his Prime Minister Barnier, who he appointed, who's obviously very well known in Brussels, led on the Brexit negotiations, but leads a minority government, ultimately. Because of the number of seats that Marine Le Pen's party have, they can hold this government hostage. One of the key issues that's really being kind of played out in real time at the moment is discussions over the budget. And Marine Le Pen has already said that she's more than happy to bring the government down over this discussion because she feels that the budget is not fair. It would see massive tax increases because of France's economic situation, which is just not...
And this is just the point that Midge was making. These governments with ageing societies, as we know in Britain, are trying to find ways to raise the money that Mario Draghi says they need to invest as well as spend on healthcare and all this. But then it proves very, very controversial about how to raise that money.
Yes, and I think, the kind of the ideas, the gap between the ideas and the policies versus the implementation is very clear. And it's the same with the Green Deal, where we know that we need the green transition, but we've seen the backlash against that when it comes to the farmers' protests, etc.
Timothy, I'm not trying to reduce everything that is going on in Europe to economics, but just to bring out just how important this is as these governments try to find a way through this predicament. In Germany, it has a particular resonance, doesn't it? This argument about whether it is safe, whether it is nationally acceptable to borrow more, to invest, as our own Chancellor might say.
Well, it not only has particular resonance, there's a debt brake written into the Constitution, which most people now recognize, certainly privately, is a huge obstacle to doing what is needed, both to make up for the lack of investment over the Merkel years. I've just been reviewing Angela Merkel's memoirs, and this is one of the things that the problems she left behind, and the new tasks, so to speak, the Draghi agenda and the defense agenda. So the question is, first of all, the timing is disastrous in the German case, because basically we now have a caretaker government until the election on the 23rd of February. Then you have coalition negotiations, which, depending on the composition of the parliament, can take many months. So it may be we have 6 months before you have a government in place. Then there are workarounds around the debt brake, but it depends which parties you have in the coalition and whether they're willing to go with those. In fact, the coalition fell apart on precisely this issue. And if you're going to change the constitution, the debt brake in the constitution, you need a two-thirds majority. And there may be a blocking minority in the Bundestag. So the problems in the German case are enormous, and it may be well towards the second half of the year before we begin to see how the likely next chancellor, Friedrich Merz of the Christian Democrats, and whoever his coalition partners are going to address it. The structural problem here, which has been the European structural problem for decades, is that the policies we need are now European, but the politics remain national. And that's a fundamental structural problem, which in a way Juncker was referring to and has simply not been addressed.
I'm pausing as you say that because policies, in a sense, are European, but some of these economic ones could be addressed nationally.
The policies we need, so for example, on defense, it's quite clear, even if we spend more, that we need a joined-up defense procurement policy, a joined-up European defense policy. Draghi is talking about the policies we need to compete with the big American tech platforms, for example. The policies we've got, of course, are still very largely national.
And I think that takes us straight to this key point of defence, which I wanted to bring in, and defence and the threat from Russia. Midge, we have this question of whether Europe can respond in a coherent way to Russia and now to a US that under Donald Trump may be very equivocal about pouring more into Ukraine. How do you see Europe's ability at this point, and with it taking perhaps quite a long time, as Timothy's just described, to get a German leader? What is Europe's ability to answer this question as a whole?
So, Bronwen, just one thing in response to what Timothy just said. If you look at the three areas where the EU is now struggling the most, migration, security and defence, and fiscal space, these are the three areas that completely define what it means to be a nation state. And so that's why I completely concur with Tim's point. It is precisely why.
That is a really good way of putting it. These are the big three we keep coming back to. And as you said, these do feel very national challenges.
Yeah, it's the areas where governments struggle the most to pull sovereignty at the European level, albeit that's exactly what we need to see happen for these issues to be addressed. On your question on Europe's response to Trump, I was in Brussels all of last week. I was actually quite impressed by how much work and thinking has been done within the institutions, Commission, the Council, to some extent with the European Parliament, but also the extent of back channeling that's been taking place with NATO and Mark Rutte, with Macron certainly, but also with both leaders in Germany, Olaf Scholz and Friedrich Merz, because I think there is a recognition that when a lot of the action takes place, if I can put it that way, when Trump comes into power on the 21st of January, Olaf Scholz is going to be Germany's chancellor. And it's unlikely we're going to have a coalition government with a new agreement in place before Easter. And so a lot of the near-term critical decisions are going to be undertaken in a heated campaign, probably by Scholz, but Merz will need to be involved if it looks as if he is indeed going to be forming the next government. Now, I think Europe's response is going to start with Ukraine. I think there's, of course, a lot of thinking about the broader security and defense piece. There's a lot of thinking about trade. There's a lot of thinking about the posture vis-a-vis China, where Trump is going to probably push the Europeans to become even more hawkish than they have been. But I think the immediate problem is Ukraine, right? If Trump comes in and he is committed to, quote unquote, resolving the conflict in 24 hours, how can the EU respond? And I think the effective response, I think, is we've got to put a lot more money on the table in order to demonstrate, number one, credibility to Trump, that we are going to take responsibility for this conflict, that it is in the European security neighborhood and we need to shoulder more of the burden. But that also gives Trump a win because he can claim, look, the Europeans are moving on Ukraine and looking to take more financial responsibility precisely because of the pressure that I'm placing upon them. And so there is a lot of discussion around raising 100, 150, even 200 billion additional financing for Ukraine in the very short term. It may not be implemented in February, but I think the Europeans want to plan to put on the table when Trump is in power very early on in late January or indeed early February.
Armida, you've looked a lot at European security and NATO. Do you think that Europe is shaping up to give a coherent response to this?
I think it is when it comes to Ukraine, but I think the bigger issue is that of US leadership in NATO and US leadership when it comes to transatlantic security. Because there, I really don't think that there is a single European NATO ally who can take over the baton in that regard. If we look at some of the key contenders, I mean, Germany, we've talked about, the government has fallen apart, but also it just doesn't have that military strategic vision. It doesn't have the leadership. It doesn't have the concept. It doesn't have the training, etc. France, Macron is being held hostage by Le Pen. The UK has had a real-time cut in defense spending really in the budget, and it's really only an expeditionary force. Poland is spending 4% on defense spending, which is great, but it does have retention issues within the military, and it's still waiting on capabilities to be delivered. So I think the real issue is if the US disengages, whatever shape that may take, from European security and from NATO, who's going to step up to the plate and who can step up to the plate? And there, I don't think there's a single European ally who can do that. And when we were in Berlin at our conference, the former Dutch defense minister, Kajsa Ollongren, put it quite eloquently, and she was advocating for coalitions of the willing. If there isn't a single leader, and if trying to do a consensus base is too slow, then maybe coalitions of the willing is a way forward. But perhaps also the other thing to mention, I think, is on the defense industrial piece, because what we need at the moment is to develop a European defense industrial base, which means European countries spending more on defense, but also spending it in Europe. Whereas with Trump's re-election, what we'll end up seeing, I think, is a more seeking of bilateral relations with the US as European countries try to buy Trump support vis-a-vis their own security. And what that means in practice is that European taxpayers' money is going to be spent on American companies and on American jobs in the US rather than in Europe. And I think that's a real issue as we are at this critical juncture where we need to have that European defense industrial base.
Timothy, do you think Europe can provide Ukraine with a security guarantee if the US doesn't offer that? And actually, am I right in thinking that you gave the proceeds of a prize that you won to Ukraine to buy missiles?
Yes, I did. I didn't
You're
quite
part of
run to a whole missile, but
right.
it was
Fin of a missile.
high-tech drones, which I gave to a battalion. And actually, I spoke to the battalion commander when I was last in Ukraine in September, and it turned out he was in the Kursk region. Yeah, that was a
All
prize.
right. You're part of the coalition of the willing, then.
I'm part of the coalition of the willing, indeed, individually.
So helped by award-winning historians, what can Europe do?
So I totally agree with Armida. The way forward has to be coalitions of the willing European countries, because by no means all of them are willing. I mean, Viktor Orban's Hungary is certainly not willing, and Robert Fico's Slovakia is anything but willing. The big question is to what extent Germany is willing. Interestingly, Friedrich Merz has talked several times, and I saw him in Berlin a couple of weeks ago, about starting with a contact group of Germany, France, Poland, and Britain. So he's including Britain in that, leading group. The problem is, number one, the situation in Ukraine, as I mentioned, I was last there in September, is dramatic. The Russians are advancing on the Eastern Front faster than at any time since 2022. The Kursk incursion is proving extremely costly and difficult to sustain. And only last night we had yet another massive attack on the energy infrastructure. So the country is really being ground down. And we now know, I've literally just printed out, we know who Trump's plenipotentiary for Ukraine is going to be, a former Lieutenant General Keith Kellogg. And what they're going to do, it appears, is to say, we will go on supporting you to some level so long as you sit down and make a deal with Putin. Now, that doesn't mean they're actually going to get a deal, because Putin may not be willing to make a deal because he's winning. And Zelensky may not be willing to make a deal because that deal would be the end of him politically at home. But nonetheless, that's what the US is going to try. Now, is Europe in this situation, big question, going to say, we're going to do something completely different and go on supporting Ukraine, for as long as it takes to get the deal they want to get?
I was just going to say, I think the answer to that, Tim, is yes, they are. I think there is if you think about the narrative from the EU over the last 2 years, it's been, Negotiations will only take place at a moment of Ukraine is choosing number one and from a position of Ukraine strength number two. And it looks as if neither of those conditions is now going to be met as Ukraine is forced into a negotiation against its will from a position of weakness early next year. And I think it is in response to that risk, there is a lot of, I think, quite mature thinking about the need to signal to Trump and signal to Ukraine, and certainly signal to Russia, that's spending 7% of its GDP on munitions and its military, that we are going to equip Ukraine to remain in the fight and be credible in walking out of the negotiating room if they feel a bad deal is in the offing. And that's why I think we are going to see plans come online very early next year. I think a lot of this actually will need to pass through parliaments in December if they want the plan ready for January, to be able to present a plan that says, if we are going to be credible on Ukraine and Ukraine can keep fighting, albeit while negotiating, we need to put a lot more money on the table. The agreement in the G7 to bring on an additional 50 billion, I think, is only estimated to last until the middle of next year, especially if US aid is going to taper. So in order to mitigate against these risks, I expect a big financial package to be announced in late December, early January. And I feel quite confident about that because all of the senior people in Brussels are working on this plan with a view to unveiling it on the other side of Trump's inauguration.
Midge, I very much hope you're right. I'm sure you're right for Ursula von der Leyen's European Commission. I'm sure you're right for France, for Britain, for Poland, for the Baltics, Sweden and Finland and so on. The big question is Germany, because Scholz, who, as you say, is still currently the caretaker chancellor, is positioning himself as the Friedenskanzler, the Chancellor of Peace, to win back votes, particularly from Bundesrat Wagenknecht. And there's quite a lot of support for that position. So think about it. Trump makes this peace offer, whatever it is, this peace proposal on January the 21st. That is to say, a month before the German election on February 23. How's that going to play out in the German election? So I think the big question is which way Germany goes on this.
The sense in Brussels, Tim, was he may be positioning himself as a peace chancellor. That still does not prevent the fact Europe will need to put a lot more money down for Ukraine. And where Scholz could potentially then come in is saying, look, this is not for arms, it's for reconstruction. Interestingly, the big block to money for Ukraine in Germany was not Scholz, it has been Lindner. And Lindner is no longer in the coalition. So if there is an attempt to circumvent the debt brake, something Scholz wanted to do in the context of the budget next year, Lindner was the constraint, not Scholz. And so I feel a bit more bullish about, in a situation, even as he wants to run as a peace chancellor, him not being responsible for vetoing Europe's ability to put this package together for Ukraine early next year. I may be wrong, but that's my sense.
I want to go to Armida at this point. We're coming towards the end. And Armida, I wonder if we can just pan out for a second. What does this picture of Europe, formed of coalitions of the willing on this question or that question, what does this do to the notion of Europe?
I mean, I think it's absolutely clear that Europe is deeply divided. If we look at the political situation, which, Timothy mentioned Hungary, and Hungary doesn't stand alone. If we look at how it's approaching the conflict in the Middle East, if we look at how it's approaching China, where, again, Germany and France stand on opposite sides of the spectrum. So Europe is really deeply divided on key issues that could be transformational to what Europe looks like in the next 2, 5, 10 years. And I suppose my fear is that if Europe can't come together coherently, cohesively, it's going to undermine itself just by virtue of being so divided. And I think that's a real risk because the external security landscape is so poor at the moment, both east, both west, south, north, whichever way you look. I mean, as Timothy was saying very eloquently earlier, we need solutions on the European level. But I think given where we are politically and domestically, it's going to be incredibly hard to do that.
Timothy, are we looking at the end of the old Europe that acted together?
No, I wouldn't say that. I mean, clearly we are at the beginning of a new period of European history. A new period began on the 24th of February 2022 with all the trends inside, but also mainly outside Europe, Putin, Trump. Also, we haven't mentioned the fact that we're clearly now in what I would call a post-Western world. I mean, the fact that great and middle powers like China, India, Russia, Turkey, Brazil, South Africa can effectively counterbalance the West when it comes to the Russian economy. These are defining challenges. I think the way I would put it is that not for decades have we seen the forces of integration and disintegration, so to speak, the centripetal and centrifugal forces so finely balanced. And really it's up to us and up to leadership and our politics to see which way it tips. And I'm delighted to hear Midge sounding so optimistic.
Is that right, Midge?
I mean, I go back and forth on this, Bronwen. You know, we look at the role of, say, a Viktor Orban in the EU, and it's true, you know, he has been a major constraint on some of the things the EU wants to do. At the same time, there is always a way to devise policy to get around the Orban veto. You know, it didn't prevent the G7 agreeing to the 50 billion. It hasn't prevented 14 rounds of sanctions being placed upon the Russian economy. I think the sense in Brussels last week was, look, Trump wants to do deals and Orban can't carry and deliver the 27. Von der Leyen can. And so is Trump going to be pleased with his proxy in the EU if that proxy is preventing the Union agreeing to a package of measures that ultimately mean a lot more fiscal transfers to the US? I think Orban's stance on China is also at complete odds with where Donald Trump wants to be. And so,
though actually Germany sided with him on that, on that particular point about tariffs on solar panels and electric vehicles. I mean, the shock of Germany voting with Orban and that is one of the things that brings this question to life.
yeah, it's just, I guess, to make the point that I question how much leverage Orban actually has in a universe where Trump is coming in and wants the EU to deliver deals that will ultimately benefit him. And if Orban is the constraint to that happening, it's not obvious to me that's in Trump's interest. So, you know, I'm trying to think through and reassess how I think about Orban's leverage in a universe where Trump is in, and the answer isn't as obvious to me.
I mean, I agree on the Orban point. He is not seen as, he's not legitimate by, or considered legitimate to certainly carry the voice of the EU by the other leaders. But what I will say is we also know from Trump's first mandate that he doesn't like the EU. And so in terms of dealing directly with von der Leyen, I don't think he's going to try and do that. I think he's going to try and go for those he already knows. So Orban can't carry the EU 27, but Meloni in Italy perhaps can. And she is also more liked in Brussels among the European Commission because she's been seen so far as a more constructive player, regardless of what she's doing in Italy, which is deploying the domestic liberal playbook, which we've discussed on this podcast previously. But so Meloni has more legitimacy than Orban and already has connections to Trump. So given Trump's feelings about the EU and that he feels that it's unfair because, you know, it's basically countries banding together, I'm not even sure that he'll want to try and speak directly to von der Leyen or to Costa.
I very much agree with that. And also the party of Trump is much bigger than just Viktor Orban. It's Robert Fico, it's Kaczynski, it's Le Pen, it's Geert Wilders. And I'm not at all sure which way Meloni will jump. I mean, ideologically, she's much closer to Trump. So she could be our Trump whisperer for the EU, but she could also go more to the Trump direction. On the other hand, just to add a note of optimism, rare optimism from my side, the first thing he's probably going to do is slap tariffs on almost everybody, but notably on the EU. And there, Orban can't have his own policy because it's an EU competence. And so I think the tariffs could potentially be a real unifying factor.
Really interesting point. Let me just slide in right at the end the question of the role for Britain, which may, on the tariffs point, want to position itself as not Europe and say to the US, look, not us, we're not like them, but may also be looking to this much more complicated European picture as a way of having a closer relationship with Europe without having to observe all the things that you have to if you're part of the European Union.
If I may just jump in there, and I'm sure others will have views as well, but I think if anything, this makes the UK-EU reset all the more important. However, that reset has been a little bit slow to get going, if we're honest. The continental European partners are saying, well, we haven't really seen much of it. We're kind of waiting for the UK's offer. So there's a risk of mismanagement there, of expectation. And what we're also seeing is that Trump is already trying to drive a wedge between the UK and the EU. So The question there will be thinking about the long-term UK interest, what's best for the UK, and that's something that Starmer will have to navigate very, very carefully.
I think that Trump makes the UK-EU reset both more necessary and more difficult. More necessary because of security policy, more difficult because of economic policy. Because there is, as you mentioned, Bronwen, a very clear temptation to play special relationship on economic policy. Give us a sweet deal. We have this special relationship. We already hear the sound voices from the United States saying that. And I think that's going to be a big, big temptation. Amusingly, Peter Mandelson, who may or may not be our next ambassador to Washington, when he was pushed on this, said, well, really, I suppose we have to try and have our cake and eat it. That sounded rather familiar to me. I seem to remember a man called Boris Johnson
And
saying.
it may sound very familiar to the Americans as well.
But it's not going to work. I mean, just to add, I'd love to hear Midge on this. It's not going to work. I think this is a moment of real strategic choice. And as Armida rightly said, what we have to do really, if I may be prescriptive for a moment, is to understand that our bigger long-term economic interest is with, by far, our biggest single market, which is the EU. So I think it's a real moment of choice.
Midge, I'm going to give you the final word.
I agree with Tim Bronwen, of course, but I fear that is not where Downing Street is and is going to be. They're going to play it down the middle, right? Because tariffs on the UK economy will blow apart Rachel Reeves' fiscal strategy. I think they're quite disorganized on the reset. They are testing interesting ideas in private with the Commission.
I'm struck by the bilateral deal that they've done with Germany on defence. They're trying some things, but I think Armida's absolutely right. It has been very slow to get going.
I don't think they've got a clear idea of what they're trying to do on the reset, and I think Trump simply complicates that. So I'm very skeptical you see an acceleration of said reset. Even this meeting in February that Costa's now called, where he wants Rutte and Starmer to attend, not obvious to me Starmer will go, because I think they really want to avoid creating the perception of binary choices. And so it's self-evident and obvious, of course, Starmer should go and talk about security and defence with the European Council, but they will be really worried, I think, about the signal that sends to Trump. And so I think they're quite disorganized, they're quite confused, and they're going to try and play it both ways. I don't think they're going to make a strategic choice, albeit I agree with Tim that they should, but I don't think they will.
I think I put it even more strongly, I think they're going to try not to make a strategic choice between the two, but still to try to edge forward some kind of reset with Europe, but they're going to have to get down to details very soon. And as we have been discussing, Europe has lots of other things on its mind. There's something of a competition for time. On which note, we are going to have to stop. Thank you to my guests, Armida van Rij, Timothy Garton Ash, Mujtaba Rahman. Do follow them all on X and Blue Sky, where you can also find Chatham House. All the details are in the show notes, and as well as all the fabulous sessions from our conference in Berlin that I mentioned at the start. We're continuing to examine these questions in an event on the 10th of December, and you can find all the details about safeguarding Europe, how to defeat and deter Russia at chathamhouse.org. And a reminder that you can find all the episodes of Independent Thinking on all major podcast platforms. So please do like, follow, subscribe, and tell your friends. For now, that's it for me, Bronwen Maddox. See you next week.